Well, I want to welcome everyone to Asia Society today for this program. We are very delighted to have with us, return to us, Ambassador Kurt Tong. He's formerly the US Consul General to Hong Kong and Macau. He's currently managing partner for the Asia Group based in Washington, D.C. And we're also delighted to have with us Professor Christine Loh, one of our scholars in residence, to moderate and interview the ambassador. She is professor at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. I wanted to call your attention to our many upcoming business and policy programs. We have a discussion on Europe with the Dean of Sciences Po University, a screening of Anna Coren's latest documentary on Afghanistan, panel discussions with AGI fellows. There's lots of reasons to take up a membership with us, and members get even more programs than these, so please consider joining as a member. And with that, please enjoy your lunch, and we'll start the program after most of the lunch is concluded. Thank you.
We will start our process now. I'm Christine Loh from the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and it is my privilege to act as moderator today. Kurt Tong, Ambassador Tong, is a veteran of 30 years at the State Department. We remember him best for his time as Consul General to Hong Kong and Macau. He has held many important positions, including Ambassador to APEC. He has also advised the White House on economic affairs and commercial diplomacy. After leaving the State Department, he joined the Asia Group, and he is managing partner and a member of its executive committee. So may I invite Ambassador Tong to come. He will give us his remarks, and then I will sit down with him and moderate a discussion. And I know from speaking to some of you that I know you have a lot you want to share. So please do. Ambassador Tong.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to see you all. Nice to be back at the Asia Society, and thank you, Christine, for the introduction, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. So this week has kind of been, I got in on Thursday night, and on Friday spoke at Ocean Park at something called Master Insights, which was the venue for the last 4th of July party that I hosted in Hong Kong when I was still a government official. So that was very nostalgic to see this big room but then talk to people in a different role. And as some of you might recall, I think Alvin probably does, my last speech in Hong Kong as Consul General was in this room. At that time, I was gagged by Mike Pompeo, and I had to give my remarks off the record. We later published them online, so you could read it if you want to. And the consulate took them a very long time to delete the speech, so it was there quite a while, and it might be there in the cache if you look for it. But it was a different atmosphere. So today we've got beautiful sunshine, and people seem to be smiling, and no one's angry that I'm here. On July 2nd, which was the date after the invasion of the Legislative Council, we had 200 protesters out front. And my daughter, who was here, was very impressed with me and thought it was just very exciting that I was being protested. Almost as excited as she was when I had the opportunity to host Will.i.am once in Tokyo. And that was even more exciting. But anyways, I'm glad to be here. It's nice to be back. What I'd like to do today is just chat for about, as Christine said, maybe 10-15 minutes with some overall impressions on this topic of Hong Kong in the context of US-China relations, and try and give you a bit of what I hope is a relatively objective view of how Hong Kong is viewed from the American side. Because I live in Washington, D.C., and I can can share with you, I think, fairly accurately what the perception is of Hong Kong from the United States, which you're not going to, you probably already realize you're not going to like what I'm going to say, but I'm going to share that and try and be as objective as possible about that. And then also share some thoughts about how I see Hong Kong reacting to the U.S. reaction to Hong Kong, sort of the U.S. view, and then how that's being handled here, and then go ahead and pontificate for just a couple minutes with some ideas about the way forward in that context, which you can take or leave, or criticize harshly in Q&A, because I don't live here anymore, right? So I don't know as much about Hong Kong's actual situation as anyone else in this room. And so it's with some trepidation that I make any comments or suggestions. But please take it in the form of dialogue rather than any kind of presumptuous prescriptions. And by the way, it doesn't matter what I think because I'm just a private businessman. By way of explaining that, after leaving government, I've worked for 4 years in a consulting company. We have hired and I've opened an office here in Hong Kong. George Chen, who many of you know, raise your hand so everyone be sure to know who George is managing director for Hong Kong and Taiwan, based here in Hong Kong. We expect to grow this operation, and we're looking for more clients. So if you know anyone that wants advice on international affairs, geopolitics, and how corporations can navigate these issues, and look for partners and opportunities in the context of a rather treacherous global environment these days, please send them our way. We're always looking for more work. But it is purely private sector. So all of my clients are private sector. I don't represent the U.S. government, don't work for the U.S. government, for the most part don't agree with the U.S. government, and so please just take that enormous grain of salt as we talk. So enough prefatory remarks. I want to say thank you to Regina for joining us today. Everyone, of course, knows Regina, the head of the Executive Council, and I must want to point out that she's the only person that is appropriately attired today for Halloween. I don't see anyone else here, and even the Princetonians, right? There's 5 Princetonians in the room today, and none of them has a black or orange tie on today, or dress. And so, Regina, congratulations to you for being culturally aware. So the view of Hong Kong from DC. Now I'm going to start by saying this. So when I approach people who know nothing about Hong Kong and very little about China, which describes much of the population of the United States and Washington, and I say I used to live in Hong Kong, the reaction that I get is, "Oh, I'm so sorry." That's really the reaction. I get it over and over again. Like, you must be so sad about what happened to Hong Kong and the situation there. And that is, to me, is kind of, and then I end up spending usually longer than the person that made that comment wanted to hear, telling them about the actual situation in Hong Kong, the pros and the cons, the complexity of it all, how it fits into US-China relations, et cetera. But that awareness is very, very, very thin, because the general population in the United States and the political population in Washington, D.C. only has information coming from the media to assess the situation with. Very few people are traveling here. COVID got in the way of communication to a significant extent. And looking at the media, what you see is headlines about people in prison and political changes in Hong Kong, which don't reflect well upon the city. And that is the predominant form of information that people are subjected to. And then in addition to that, and because of COVID, there is a gap between different parts of the U.S. private sector. So the U.S. private sector is much more interested, businesses are much more interested in Hong Kong than regular citizens or even government people. And they have a stake in Hong Kong, and many of them are invested here. and do business here, particularly in finance. But even there's a gap in perceptions between the people that are working on the ground here and visiting here frequently and people in headquarters who are not visiting here frequently and have questions about. And so, American company corporate people ask me, or they ask each other, is it safe to travel to Hong Kong, right? Which the U.S. State Department, unfortunately, was reinforcing up until recently with its inaccurate description about the risks of traveling to Hong Kong. But that gap, even within the most informed part of the U.S. system, the private sector, between headquarters and branch office, compounded by the media information, which is not inaccurate. I'm not saying that the bad news stories about Hong Kong are inaccurate, but there is no information or very little reporting about other aspects of Hong Kong society and other aspects of the economy, and how Hong Kong itself is trying to manage in the overall situation of the difficult context of US-China relations. So that's point number one. Point number two, which is also not good news for Hong Kong, actually, is the deep suspicion and high level excuse me, of distrust that now prevails in the official relationship, the government-to-government relationship between the U.S. and China. And from the U.S. side, which is what I know best, this is defined both officially and actually as competition. And the mindset of the U.S. government looking towards China is primarily one of risk avoidance, or de-risking, as is commonly discussed now in the technology sector, or a sense of competition, that everything is about competition. And very rarely do you hear about win-win solutions plus some problem sets. You know, I was teaching my graduate school class this morning. You probably, Christine, have the same discussion with your students about how there are all different kinds of interactions that take place, and the goal in much of either private commercial discourse or government-to-government relations is to try and get to a win-win solution from what's identified as a lose-lose situation. Very little willingness to do that now. So, for example, when President Xi and President Biden get together in 2 weeks in San Francisco, which is a hugely positive development and very important for regional history, they probably won't announce any negotiations on trade or investment or technology, and rather will restrict themselves to some improved communication on problem mitigation and risk mitigation, particularly with respect to issues like South China Sea and military-to-military communication and the like. So the overall context under Biden is seeking stability in the U.S.-China relationship, but still framed around competition rather than cooperation. So what does that mean for Hong Kong? Well, Hong Kong is all about, whichever vocabulary you choose to use, superconducting, super connector, or center of regional commerce, et cetera, et cetera. It's all about win-win solution finding. And Hong Kong's lifeblood for the last 200 years has been win-win solutions, primarily driven out of private sector context in order to make itself relevant and earn profit off of interactions between the much larger economy to the north and the rest of the global economy. So I'm not giving you good news so far, right? U.S. sort of dismissive and not paying attention to the details of Hong Kong and the overall context of U.S.-China relations being difficult. The reactions that I see in Hong Kong to that state of affairs is 3 different types. And again, feel free to criticize this analysis, but this is what I think I see. Occasionally sort of a voice of despair, like, what can we do? We're just little Hong Kong. we have no voice in this matter, and somewhere between despair and fatalism, like this is beyond us to be involved in, and we'll just have to wait and see how it plays out, and voicelessness. Another is to shoot the messenger, and that's a perfectly legitimate thing to do when the messenger's got the message wrong or the information wrong. And so accusing the US media of sort of not inaccurate, but rather focused, shall we say, reporting on Hong Kong is okay. You can do that, but it's not going to improve the situation. In fact, it might cause people to double down and wonder why people are being so defensive. And so that sort of whataboutism, or Hong Kong has diminished electoral system freedoms compared to previously. Okay. Well, what about Singapore? I hear that a lot. You all hear it too, and you probably do it too, and I do it too. What about Singapore? Singapore's not so great either. And what about this place, and what about that place? That is a reaction, but it's not as direct a response to the circumstances, I think, as others. And the third, which is the hardest, is in that circumstance to show confidence in the strengths of the city and the strengths of the system, and the two systems framework, and advertise and emphasize those strengths, and continue to do so in a consistent way going forward. And this is what you hear. I think you hear this. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you hear this from the U.S. Chamber, the American Chamber. Like, let's talk about two systems a lot, because there's a lot to talk about in terms of the government outreach and people speaking about Hong Kong to non-Hong Kong audiences. And I see a lot of wisdom in that approach within the confines of one country, and the necessity to stress one country. There is flexibility, and President Xi himself exhibited this flexibility when he visited, to speak about two systems as well, right? And so what are some of the positive, I'll close on giving my opinion, which again you don't have to agree with, on some of the opportunities that two systems creates, and then some of the risks that might be pending in the near term in the one country, two systems context. I actually think, and I've overcome my skepticism about the Greater Bay Area. I used to be a huge Greater Bay Area skeptic. Like, if they're not just going to change Guangzhou into Hong Kong, then why bother, right? Is one way of analyzing the Greater Bay Area. But the physical connectivity and the degree of business integration that you start to see, with much of the activity really being done according to Hong Kong rules, even though it's being done under PRC law perhaps, but the way that business is getting financed in Shenzhen, and the way that business is happening across the border between Shenzhen and Hong Kong and involving Guangzhou is really interesting, and it's very dynamic. And Americans like to say, oh, this is just like nothing, there's nothing, don't look here. But there's something there. And I think that talking about that should be a real talking point. My personal recommendation would be to stick with that as a business person. It's quite relevant, it's quite interesting. It runs in, there's all kinds of problems with U.S. technology denial strategy, et cetera, for Shenzhen, but there's still a lot of opportunity in that context. I think doubling down on it's really good that Hong Kong's built a third runway and a second terminal, although someone told me you're not supposed to call it a terminal, you're supposed to call it something non-terminal. But having an expanded transportation capability and retaking the crown as the center of regional aviation is something where you're going to get a lot of through traffic as a result, and very, very important to Hong Kong competitiveness. I think working to maintain relevance of, and there's a FinTech conference coming up later this week, right? And one of my staffers is coming from Washington to attend that specifically at my personal expense, basically, in order to right, George? Yeah. to learn about that, because as the financial sector evolves into a high-tech, AI-driven, IT-driven business, maintaining that relevancy in finance is something that Hong Kong can do, using two systems and convincing the global holders of future AI power to treat Hong Kong as a friendly place where they should be working. That is quite both an opportunity and a little bit of a danger point if that doesn't happen, that the financial sector could become less relevant if Hong Kong is not a center for IT and AI. And I think that I see the Hong Kong government focused on that, which is quite smart. And then the other one I would list, and I do see the Hong Kong government and TDC's part of this, is reaching out to the Global South and continuing to reinforce Hong Kong as a place to make deals, using common law jurisdiction and using the information base that's available and the smart consultants and lawyers, et cetera, that continue to be collected here with some attrition due to COVID and political factors, but for the most part, still widely available. I think Mark's still here. There's a lot of smart people around, and continuing to make those connections with the Global South, while at the same time realizing that as a services-based economy and a finance-based economy, the real big markets are North America and Europe. So balancing that Global South agenda where the receptivity is going to be greater because of the connection with China than in Europe and North America, but also maintaining the outreach to Europe and North America seems to me to be really, really important. So then on the risk side, I think I'm not giving you any news here, but particularly in 2024, there will be Article 23 legislation, right? We're told that's going to happen. There's going to be a cybersecurity law, which may or may not be all that significant. It could just refer to defense of critical infrastructure, which is something that every jurisdiction should do. But it might go beyond that. And then there's other things which seem to be creeping up on the agenda in 2024. Some caution points for Hong Kong as it seeks to regain and refurbish its reputation going forward. One is perhaps less obvious than the others, but I think is important, is maintaining the reputation for a place of open and free travel, educational exchange, cultural exchange. People pay attention to that and consider it a proxy for business activity. And Hong Kong's record on that I see as overall quite strong. There's been a little bit of self-censorship in the arts and the like that you hear about, but it's not that much. And so really doubling down and reinforcing on that would be good. On the flip side, the idea that that is a pernicious idea that can really spread, that there's creeping thought control in Hong Kong is a danger point, and something for people to just go ahead. And I'm the foreigner here, so I'm bringing these issues out to the surface. Some of them are uncomfortable to talk about, but that's a really key factor, I think. The other two that I want to mention are really obvious, and everybody talks about them all the time. The first is, of course, keeping the common law system, and even PRC government officials at the most senior levels reference this as a major asset of Hong Kong. It's not just the dollar peg, it's the legal system and the common law system, and maintaining the integrity of that when you have two legal frameworks now coexisting in the national security law and the common law system, and making sure that the common law system, as appropriate, continues to be the one that is most focused upon when thinking about business opportunities and business relations and contracts, is quite important. And so various test cases as they arise where the common law and the national security law come into intersect are really important to focus on. And they have repercussions well beyond the confines of those specific cases, in my opinion. And then the last one, as perhaps the most important, is the maintaining a sense of freedom of information. So I'm not, again, George is more of an expert on this than I am, but looking towards over the next 5 years in terms of how the internet is managed, regulated, and viewed by governments, there is going to be increasing government involvement in those matters across the board, even in the United States. We've got the US government going after Google on antitrust, and there are a dozen or so states suing Meta for not doing a good enough job keeping garbage away from children on their platform. And this increasing skepticism about privacy, about the power of the internet companies, is going to grow even in highly free-flowing, shall we say, political systems like that in the United States. And so in that context, Hong Kong is obviously going to be presented with these same challenges. And it would be, I think, quite harmful if Hong Kong's national security imperatives, I'm not denying that the legitimacy of those, but if those get in the way of free flow of internet information or internet businesses, it could be very detrimental to Hong Kong, because at the end of the day, it's not that big a market. And there is a potential that the global companies, as we've seen a little bit in AI, could walk away from Hong Kong, and that would be very detrimental to the economy and situation going forward. So with those senses of opportunity and cautionary notes, and again, please criticize me, because I'm here to learn, and I don't live here, and I don't necessarily, read what's going on, visited frequently, but I'd like to have an even more nuanced understanding of what's going on. And if you think I'm wrong, please correct me. But I do think overall I'm still very much an optimist about the future of the city. The One Country, Two Systems framework is a good framework for having a special place inside the PRC. And if you look at the history of the place, and I spent a lot of time when I was here as Consul General thinking about Hong Kong history. We made a big deal about the 175th anniversary of our consulate as an advertising gimmick. This city's been through a lot. Changed, how many places have changed hands like that peacefully in the course of human history? Not many, right? And continued to thrive, and changed hands twice, from China to Britain and then back again. And then even within Britain, there was a lot going on there. And now within the PRC, there's a lot going on there. But in that context, there's an emphasis on individual initiative and personal qualities that I think will redound to the benefit of Hong Kong going forward. So I went on a little bit longer than I promised. I'm sorry. Let's get into discussion.
Ambassador, thank you very much. And I think there will be a lot of questions and comments, and thank you for asking for people to also maybe share their perspective with you. Perhaps I can just warm up by asking the first question. We've heard a lot about Hong Kong, what the US and this de-risking and competition with China. And we're looking at things like chips and semiconductors, which are at the very high technological end. But actually, on the ground, our businesses here are also having difficulty with things like textile and fashion, where people are, in effect, not being encouraged, if they want the US market, to have Chinese components of low-tech stuff. So, this issue of competition, it's actually very wide, isn't it?
Well, as a legal matter, it's not, but as a as a overall business atmosphere, I think you're onto something. So as a legal matter, thus far the U.S. has sanctioned a number of specific Chinese companies that are close to the military production, has cut off access to technology in some very specific areas on semiconductors with the goal of preventing China catching up or being quickly competitive in artificial intelligence and quantum computing, primarily again for military reasons. And then there's been the restrictions on products from Xinjiang and Xinjiang input. The problem is that then for some companies, in order to have a supply chain which is beyond suspicion from the U.S. side, requires asking questions within the PRC system that people don't want to ask, right? So if you're exporting to the United States, you mentioned garments or fashion, in order to not to have a seamless import system, you would want to be asking, where did your cotton come from? Did it come from Xinjiang? But if you ask that within the Chinese system, you're asking a very politically incorrect question, right? And so that due diligence process is difficult. Meanwhile, since you're not able to present that due diligence information to the U.S., these seemingly small policy ends up having a multiplier effect. And if that's what you're referring to, I agree with that the impact is beyond what the theoretical impact is. I think the bigger question is actually in the area of investment, where the United States has now implemented some controls on outbound investment into China, which are, again, by the text of them, are very narrow. But the overall atmosphere of that regulation, plus the atmosphere created by the inbound CFIUS process, has put a real chill into bilateral investment. And investment drives trade. Investment drives the next generation of deals. So the question is, will we see a drop in U.S.-China trade, which we haven't seen thus far, as a result of U.S. government interference in the business activity? And I think the answer is probably maybe somewhat. The overall driving imperative of doing business between the U.S. and China, there's so much complementarity in economic structure and how businesses, their capabilities and ability to operate with one another, that's going to continue to drive a lot of trade, regardless of what the government's doing, unless and until there's a bigger crisis than what we currently have. So, sorry, I promised to give you short answers, but
No, that's
you asked a difficult question.
Anyway, I'm just wondering whether there are people in the investment and production sector who'd like to fill in the blanks. Please. Can we have a mic for Rona in front, please?
Hi, thank you, Ambassador and Christine. Actually, Christine's question came from our during lunch chat. I'm in the investment industry as well as the textile industry, and you talked about win-win. I don't think it's definitely not discussed. Let's have a win-win setup. But I also don't see how it's win for U.S. and, at least when the U.S. customer requires us to comply with certain things, I don't necessarily see it as a win for them either. For example, we have been receiving more and more, thick documents from our U.S. brands customers, basically requiring us to commit and comply to, obviously not using Xinjiang cotton, which then we then went into, sourcing our cotton from other places. And threat after threat. We're going to use DNA testing. If we find anything, then we're going to slap a big fine on you and no more business. And also other things like looking into the future, saying by 2025, we are not allowed to have anything in the garment that is sourced from China. So the yarn is made in China, but the knitting factory is in Vietnam. That will still not work. I don't see how that is a win for the US customer either, because prices, delivery, technology, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, that's my filling the gap.
Is there anyone who wants to add to this perspective? Or any comments from those of you who are in investments?
On the investment side, I can also comment a little bit. I know for sure that deal flow has almost dried up completely. And I think a lot of it, my fund manager friends, the US side, tell me, it's not because there are no good deals, but they have to comply. So even though the opportunities may be there, they just have to withdraw. And when so many different parties withdraw together, it's like the impact is much, much bigger.
Anyone else in the investment world? Thank you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to put in a quick comment. Ambassador, nice to see you here. I'm in the private equity business. As part of my job or profession, I also sit on a nonprofit pension institute organization in the United States, where we have about 100 global pension funds as members. We actually just came back from a Tokyo roundtable last week, where we saw Ambassador Emmanuel, American ambassador to Japan. No, my question or comment is really, I think, there is a growing feeling that the Chinese government, and at least the Chinese businesses, really want to improve the relationship, goes out of our way to convince people to come to China, come to Hong Kong, to comply, as Rona said, right? And there's a genuine desire to continue the relationship, continue the business. While on the other hand, it takes two hands to clap. It does feel that the American, particularly for the international investors, some of them actually wanted to invest in China. Some of them try to find ways to hide their China investment in the broader category of Asia and to make those investments. But their biggest fear is actually the American government. They said maybe one day the binary risk is the American government did something to cut it off. Then they will all be left there alone, having the biggest risk. So it's ironic for me to hear sometimes they're not worried about the Chinese government. They're actually worried about the American government doing something that is irrational. And I'm curious about your thoughts and views here. And I fully agree with your comment just now about Hong Kong government should be your biggest client. How to conduct its
I don't
activities.
have any government clients. Sorry.
I know, it's a joke. And the comment was really, how does the Hong Kong government, how does the Hong Kong business community encourage people to come back to Hong Kong? Because seeing is believing, right? And the 4 years of COVID restriction really caused a major misperception or a lot of confusions and portraying Hong Kong as a place that you can't travel freely to. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Anyway, so
I'm
that's
just
my
wondering
comment.
whether you, Ambassador, you can comment on the point about American businesses' fear of their own government, that they might be punished, there's just too much hassle, just let's not do anything with China. Can you comment on that?
Well, yeah, they're afraid. And because they could pay fines or face prosecution, probably not criminal prosecution, but civil prosecution for violating, in particular, the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, but also some of the export controls provisions as well. And so there's a tendency for people, when faced with a combination of strict rules and a bit of uncertainty about whether they're meeting those rules or not, to err on the side of caution. Again, the overall numbers on trade look strong. The overall numbers on investment look extraordinarily weak, and that's a leading indicator for trade, which I think is quite problematic. On the question about, I do sense that the writ large, again, the PRC is an extraordinarily large country, and very, very complex entity, both public and private. But there are the signals saying we should find a way to be accommodative of foreign concerns in order to do more business with the outside world. Those voices have increased in the last year. And I think it's because the Chinese economy has slowed down. That leads us to a different situation. So I talk to pension funds as well, and you know them better than I do. But in other conversations, they say, well, what's the long-term growth rate of China? We're looking at demographics, financial stability, increasing state interference in the domestic economy, not necessarily pointed at foreigners. No progress on privatization of state-owned enterprise, massive overinvestment in infrastructure, insufficient freedom and access to capital for services businesses and consumer-facing businesses. What's the growth prospects for this economy? And so I think we're at this inflection point where the political economy of the PRC needs to make adjustments in order to remain competitive. Because it's gone about as far as it can with a state-led model. But reaching that realization, particularly when the people that manage the country are not business people, and then making policy, consistent policy that reacts to that. I think the U.S. is going to be the slow one to react to if the business environment in China improves. I think the U.S. is going to be the slow one to react, and other countries are going to take advantage of it first because of its own inertia of suspicion and concern about the China threat. But how this all plays out over the next few years, I think the next few years can be a very crucial kind of inflection point as China comes to terms with the fact that it's sort of a 4% growth economy rather than an 8% growth economy. And then a 4% growth economy acts differently than one that is growing faster than the rest of the world.
There's a question over there.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and really appreciate your candid sharings just then. I've got a quick question concerning, essentially how Hong Kong can fare over the coming 18 months, whether it be in relation to the upcoming elections in the US or the Taiwan elections in January. And indeed, more generally speaking, you've pointed to the fact that businesses in the US tend to be more optimistic and phlegmatic about what's going on here on the ground, whereas in contrast, what we're also hearing is that the political scene, there's almost this increasing sense of consensus, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that in order to justify the narrative in the eyes of the Americans that China is a threat, is a rival, is something to be contained, the Hong Kong story must be one of doom and gloom in order to warrant that observation. It's almost as if the failure of Hong Kong and of one country, two systems would then be the ammunition with which the naysayers and skeptics use to justify the anti-China sentiments. In face of that reality, is there really that much agency on the part of the Hong Kong government to repair relations on its own behalf with America, or is there perhaps something more to be done on the ground there in America when it comes to convincing the bipartisan hawkish consensus in Congress that there is indeed something special and valuable about Hong Kong? So that's my question. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I think you put your finger on it. The phrase that I use is that it's very convenient for the United States to view Hong Kong as a cautionary tale of what happens when you hand the keys to a city over to the PRC government, and that's a convenient thing, and then counter narratives that run counter to that. And there's not, again, there are plenty of narratives that can reinforce that, but narratives that run counter to that get rejected because they don't fit into the mindset. So in that context, breaking through is going to be, as you state, difficult. And then so looking at the near term, as you frame the question, I think the Taiwan election is immaterial to Hong Kong. The U.S. election will result in a reinforcement of the existing narratives. And Biden has made clear that he's going to, China's not going to be anywhere, even in the top 10 issues in the U.S. election. But it's a defensive issue for an incumbent president. And his narrative will be I've been tough on China, but the relationship is stable. My competition, assuming it's Donald Trump, he says he's going to be tough on China, but when he was running things, it was chaos. That's Biden's narrative. That's not a positive narrative for China or Hong Kong. It's a purely inside the United States debate over who's more capable, with a base consensus about China as a competitor or as an adversary. So how do you break through that? Well, I think it's going to take time. It's going to take visits. Direct approaches to the U.S. government should not be discarded or ignored, and opportunities when they arise to interface directly with government decision makers are useful and important to do. But I think that'll be harder to break through than perhaps speaking with members of Congress, business leaders, and in particular, and I meant to mention this in my remarks, in the think tank community and sort of the opinion leader crowd in Washington and elsewhere, where there is more flexibility and thought, and people like to come to their own conclusions and not just fit the overall narrative. And so I would encourage even stronger efforts. There have been some to get, and not just from the United States, but also from Japan and Europe, think tank type people, academics, traveling, exchanging information, seeing the situation here. And then when they come back they issue conclusions which are not entirely favorable to Hong Kong and sort of mixed reviews, accept that as a result and as better than nothing at all, and then move forward from there. I don't know if it's probably not a satisfactory answer, but that's my view. Yes?
Mr. Michelson.
Thanks, Kurt. Welcome back again. I do remember when you gave your last so-called talk here. It was a lot more exciting outside than it was this time, but glad you're back and things are a little bit calmer. I just want to reinforce one thing. You said if you raise objections to what you said, I chair a group of regional CEOs of multinational companies, and they dread, especially American companies, they dread the Monday evening call from headquarters or sometimes from shareholders about what they've read in the news over the weekend or what they've seen in the news over the weekend, just exactly the issues you've seen, and that makes new investment, both financial and FDI, and we've seen the numbers for China especially, but also for Hong Kong, a bit slower than it used to be, and we'll see if that can be overcome. But I want to ask you about another issue. We have a lot of anniversaries. You mentioned the 175th anniversary of the U.S. here. We had the 25th anniversary of the handover. It was also the 40th anniversary this month of the link with the U.S. dollar, Hong Kong link with the U.S. dollar. That's of concern. We've mentioned the financial concerns and what sanctions might be taken. Even if it's not that, is that an area that we should be concerned about going forward, especially with the U.S. elections coming up? Not sure who's going to be elected, what their policy is going to be. Is that in play, especially on the financial side, which would have a significant impact on everyone, but especially on Hong Kong, since we're very much linked to the U.S. dollar?
So first, the peg is Hong Kong's decision, not the U.S. So anyone can peg to the U.S. dollar if they want to, as long as they can defend their currency in the ups and downs of U.S. monetary policy, and they're willing to cede control over their monetary policy to the U.S. Federal Reserve. That's a really good policy that Hong Kong has. It's very smart. I think it's a sort of a slam dunk, obviously good thing. And one of the reasons why it's good is it would be even harder for the U.S. to sanction Hong Kong banks if they're part of the dollar world than if they're part of the renminbi world, right? Because the repercussions for the dollar-based financial system would be more significant if a dollar system participating bank were sanctioned and relationships had to be unwound at great cost than was otherwise the case. I find it very instructional that in the aftermath of the passage of the national security law and the upsets of 2019, that the Congress, on its own initiative, without much help or support and a little bit of foot dragging from the Trump administration, passed the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, and then 2 years later, you never hear about it, right? I think Congress has forgotten. Please, if anyone's writing a story about this, don't remind Congress that it exists, because their ignorance is bliss in this matter, and you don't want to be tempted into doing something which I think would be bad for the United States as well as for Hong Kong, of trying to mess with deeply rooted financial relationships in some kind of sudden preemptive sanctions type fashion. So I think short answer, being tied to the dollar is good, staying tied to the dollar is good, and I'm rather skeptical about the utilization of financial sanctions at all, actually, vis-a-vis China. China is just too big. If you put financial sanctions on a small country, I won't use any specific examples in case somebody has a summer house in Fiji or something, but that works, right? It works, but it doesn't work with China.
Yes, question.
Hi. It's kind of maybe building off of your answers to Brian's question, but from what can the U.S. do to push things in Hong Kong in a positive direction? It feels to me like the U.S. leverage in Hong Kong has shrunk in the past few years. Many parties are to blame for that. But in today's political environment, what can the U.S. do, whether through diplomacy or government relations or whatever, to push things in Hong Kong
You're talking about the U.S. government?
We can start with that, but you can interpret U.S. broadly if that leads to an easier answer.
Assuming government or non-government players want to, what would you advise?
Well, it's quite different tools to pursue in government and non-government. I don't see much, as we've already established, much interest in the U.S. government in taking the first step in improving U.S.-Hong Kong relations in a fundamental way. There are various deals that one could see, grand deals, but those would be very difficult to manage in the current environment. But if it were to choose to do so, I think it would be to focus on commercial activity and do more both financial sector and industrial sector facilitation as a government to help U.S. capture more of the economic opportunity represented by Hong Kong. To be clear, the U.S. government's not doing that like with any jurisdiction or government. The U.S. has dialed itself out of trade policy, is pursuing a primarily protectionist agenda on international trade. So I don't expect that Hong Kong is going to be the first place that it turns to when it decides to reverse its approach to business promotion. U.S. politics have shifted dramatically against business, and that's part of the problem that I should have mentioned in the quandary for Hong Kong, because approaching the U.S. business community and saying, U.S. business community, please tell the rest of America that Hong Kong's a mixed bag, but the part of the bag that's good for you is good for everybody, and so please be nicer to Hong Kong. That approach should still be pursued, but it's not going to be what it once was, given that the labor unions have much greater access to the White House than the business community under the current White House. And the next White House, if it's President Trump again, it'll be sort of right-wing activist groups that have primary access to the White House and not business again. And so, anyways, I'm sorry, I hate to be so depressing, but go ahead.
But anyway, I think we've come to the magic hour, and I do want to thank you, Ambassador, for being very frank with us in your assessment about the situation in the US, the mood in the US, possibly going out for the next 1 or 2 years, and also some observations and insights that you have about what Hong Kong can do. So please join me in thanking Ambassador Tong. And we look forward to you coming back to Hong Kong again.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. And I hope you join us at, there are many future programs we have here at Asia Society. Thanks very much.